Hi everyone, welcome to June 2nd. We are in Civics and Economics, and today I'm going to show you two clips from Mr. Raymond just for review of what we've gone over. I've shown you parts 1 and 2. This will be today parts 3 and 4. And remember, we're not taking an SOL test this year, but I still thought it was important for at least to recap what we learned this year through his reviews. So when he says, know this for your state exam, know that that's not applying to us. He's actually a teacher in Florida, but he teaches what we've been covering this year as well. So just keep that in mind. I'm doing this just as a review. And then when we're finished watching this, you'll go on iExcel and you'll get to go to grade 8 social studies just again to practice some of the questions that we have gone over this year. So start right off here. Again, this is Mr. Raymond's review, and he's starting off with what political parties do you need to know?
Let's get right into politics with what you need to know about the political parties. America has what is known as a two-party system, which means two parties have dominated elections for most of U.S. history. Today, those parties are the Democrats and the Republicans. You have to have a general idea of what sets these parties apart. The Democrats are like the Federalists, who believe in an active central or national government. The Democrats believe that it's the federal government that should provide programs and services like food stamps for the poor, or Democratic President Obama's plan for health care to make sure everyone has health insurance. The Republicans believe in a smaller federal government, and that if anyone is going to provide programs like this, it should be the state governments. For them, smaller government means less taxes, and if the people spend less on taxes, the people will be able to afford these programs themselves. Republicans also feel that the government should not regulate business, and so the Democrats are known for more corporate regulations. For your state exam, think Republican small government and Democrats programs and larger government, even though in reality both parties are much more similar than they are different. Now, just because America is a two-party system, that doesn't mean that there aren't other parties, and these other parties are known as third parties. One of those parties you need to know is the Libertarians, who think that the Republicans don't want to shrink the federal government enough. They think the government should stay out of people's lives except for offering just basic services like the police and roads. We've also discussed the socialist and communist parties a few times. Remember, socialist parties believe the wealth of a society should be distributed. In other words, the rich should give up more of their money, usually in the form of taxes, to help the lower classes. Socialism usually involves the government running certain businesses like healthcare and providing this for free to the people. Communism isn't around as much after the fall of the Soviet Union, but communists used to call for the outlawing of private property and sharing of everything. They feel that the workers should control all businesses, but communism usually led to dictatorships in which it was the government that controlled all businesses. So those are some of the famous additional third parties that you need to know. Next up, what are the qualifications to hold public office in the federal government? First, we'll look at the constitutional requirements. To be the president, you must be 35 years old, live in the U.S. for at least 14 years, and this is the only position that you must be a natural-born citizen, meaning someone either born in the United States or to a U.S. citizen if born outside of America. This has been a controversial issue, as some recent candidates born outside of America have been accused of not being eligible. The president can serve for a maximum of 2 4-year terms thanks to the 22nd Amendment, or a maximum of 10 years if a vice president takes over in the last 2 years of a president's term. Senators must be 30 years old, a U.S. resident for at least 9 years, and a resident of the state that they represent. Requirements to serve in the House of Reps are that they must be at least 25 years old, a citizen for 7 years, and a resident of the state that their district is in. They don't actually have to live in the district they represent. For the Senate and the House of Reps, there are no term limits, so they can serve as long as they are elected. Other things you might be tested on as far as qualifications. For this, your test is looking for you to choose a candidate who has prior experience in similar positions. For instance, President Obama here served in the Senate before he ran for president. To serve in Congress, it would help if a candidate served in state legislatures or as a mayor or governor. They might give you two candidates and ask you why you would vote for one. And the answer is that they have more experience. You need to choose the one with more experience. You also need to know what party platforms are. Party platforms are the big ideas and goals that the parties have for the country. So Democrats would talk about programs that they want to see passed, and Republicans would probably talk about cutting taxes in their platform. You might also have to identify what a debate is. Remember, debates are discussions or usually arguments about what the candidates believe should be done to help the country or state or city, and these are to help voters decide who they agree with. Political advertisements are how candidates can reach voters, but you need to remember that these are biased and therefore not always the best source of information. You might also be tested on how interest groups and the media influence politics and the government. Now, this benchmark also includes how individuals can influence politics and the government, but we already covered this, so you know that individuals can vote and attend government meetings, petition the government, and run for office. Interest groups are organizations that try to influence the government to do things that will help their members, and this is in the form of laws or policies. Interest groups represent a wide variety of issues, from the NRA, who don't want the government making it harder to buy guns, to the Sierra Club, who want policies that will help the environment. Interest groups try to educate the public to support candidates they like we see with this AARP, which is the American Association of Retired People, who published this guide of who to vote for. One thing that all interest groups have in common is that they used lobbyist or lobbying tactics. Lobbying is going right to the lawmakers and asking them to support laws that will help whatever group they represent. So your test might ask you, how do interest groups influence the government? Your answers would be to educate the public, publicize the issues, and use lobbyists to put pressure on lawmakers. The media, and again, media means forms of communication like television, radio, newspapers, and more increasingly the internet, plays a big role in influencing the government and politics. Politicians and the government use the media to get support for their policies. But the media also serves the people by keeping an eye on the government to make sure that they don't do anything bad. And we call this the watchdog role. Other groups who influence, especially politics and getting candidates elected, are called political action committees, known as PACs. PACs spend a lot of money on advertising for candidates that they support. And just like interest groups, they try to educate the public to support the politicians they like. And in return, they expect those politicians to pass laws that are going to help them. So you need to know a few things about the communications used not just by these interest groups, but also the government in bringing their message to the people. After all, these groups and the government are not going to be successful if the people don't support their plans, because the people will just vote for someone else. In all of these communications, you must consider bias. Bias is a word that describes the opinions and incentives of the people spreading these communications. Bias means that you have strong opinions either for or against an issue or candidate. So biased information is something you have to consider in whether or not you're going to trust the information you are receiving. Very often the government will use what's known as propaganda, which is a biased information that appeals to people's emotions to try to convince them to feel a certain way or act a certain way. The goal of propaganda is to persuade the people. The best known examples of government propaganda have been used during times of war. War is a time where governments ask the people to make big sacrifices, like this World War II poster telling people to conserve gas by joining carpools. Or else, as the message says, you will be helping Hitler. Here is one trying to convince people to buy war bonds, and the state released a similar message in a practice test. Bonds are when you lend the government money, and they will pay you back with interest later on. The answer to this question as to what type of information this is propagandized information. Propaganda uses uses images to get the message across, and usually symbolism as well. So look for the symbol and the message in your test question. Another thing you have to consider is media bias. As we said, the media plays a big role in spreading political and governmental information, but the media itself can try to influence voters. In the old days, the media tried to stay unbiased, but with the rise of cable television and the internet, you have to consider the bias of the source of media when deciding if the information is fair and accurate. Fox News is known to be a TV station that greatly supports the Republican Party over the Democrats, and the same can be said for CNBC in their support for the Democratic Party. Next, your test is going to ask you to identify which level of government deals with what issues. For these test questions, they will give you a hypothetical public policy. Remember, public policy is a plan to resolve an issue or problem. They also might give you a governmental agency to consider as the group to deal with this issue. Since you can't possibly know all of the hundreds of governmental agencies that exist, you really want to look for the clue of what level of government should handle the problem. So you're going to have to read these questions carefully. Knowing which level of government deals with what types of policies will help you answer the question. For the national government, anything dealing with the military, interstate or international trade, big environmental issues that spread beyond state lines, or healthcare are going to be national policies and national agencies. For the states, if it's about education, trade within a state, in-state environmental issues, and public safety issues like dealing with driver safety or state police, look for state agencies. Local government deals with local schools like the buildings and the buses, crosswalks, etc. They deal with local roads and safety on these roads like traffic lights and speed limits, trash collection, local safety issues like bicycle helmets and texting while driving. You want to find a local agency to deal with these issues. We're going to look at these levels a little bit more, but remember, if you see an agency with the city name, that means it's local policy. Agencies with state names, with state policies, and national agencies will most likely have the U.S. in their name. Okay, what's the difference between foreign and domestic policy? Remember, the word domestic means home, so these are policies to deal with issues that happen inside of America. Dealing with education, welfare benefits to help the people, healthcare, and public safety are all examples of domestic policies. Foreign is how the government deals with other countries. Diplomacy or building relations and treaties with other countries is an example of foreign policy, as is international trade and the U.S. military. What part of the government deals with foreign policy? Well, you remember the president and Congress are in charge of setting foreign policy. The president signs treaties, appoints ambassadors who are representatives to other countries, appoints the Secretary of State, who is the president's chief advisor on international events. The president serves as the commander-in-chief of the military and the chief diplomat to meet with foreign leaders. The president must work with Congress for these policies. The Senate confirms treaties or agreements with other countries and confirms ambassadors and the Secretary of State. That's a big test question. Congress also has the power to declare war, and they are in charge of providing funding or the money that the president needs to carry out all of their foreign policy plans. What international organizations does the U.S. participate? The U.S. has signed 2 treaties to join organizations that you are supposed to be tested on: NATO and NAFTA. NATO is a collective security group or a defensive treaty in which members must protect other members from foreign attacks. NAFTA is a free trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, in which all 3 countries agree to not tax each other's imports. Remember, taxes on imports are known as tariffs. The U.S. is also a member of the United Nations, an international organization of 193 countries tasked with the mission of keeping peace and helping its member nations. The UN has several programs such as UNICEF, which provide aid to children. The UN also has the World Court, or the International Court of Justice, with the goal of providing a place where disputes between countries can be settled. And this is a place to charge leaders of countries who commit commit war crimes or other crimes against humanity. The WTO is the World Trade Organization. Like NAFTA, this is about countries trading with each other without imposing protectionist taxes or tariffs on each other's products. You also have to know NGOs, or non-governmental organizations. And these are organizations that are not aligned to countries or governments, but operate in countries that allow them to help. For instance, the United States is not a member of the Red Cross, but there is a U.S. Red Cross organization, and they operate in America without much governmental oversight. And that's why they're called NGOs. They're non-governmental. Other NGOs include Doctors Without Borders, Save the Children, and Oxfam, and all of these operate around the world independent of countries or governments. How has the U.S. government reacted to international conflicts? The number one way for the U.S. government to deal with conflicts is through diplomacy, which means building relationships with other countries. If your test asks you what is the first step in dealing with a country that is doing bad things, you want to look for a peaceful solution, in other words, diplomacy. The government also wants to develop alliances or friendships with other countries, as they have with NATO. Of course, the most extreme way to deal with international conflicts is through war. We spoke in our previous lesson on how the U.S. government has been fighting wars recently without actually declaring war. The last big wars in which Congress declared war were World War I and II, two massive wars between European countries as well as Asian countries like Japan and China. But since then, presidents have used military force without declaring war, like in Vietnam and Afghanistan. Many conflicts since World War II that the U.S. has been involved in have been NATO conflicts. And NATO has played a big role in the Cold War, that decades-long conflict between the United States and the communist Soviet Union. The U.S. government will also place sanctions and embargoes to block trade with a country which they have had on Cuba for the past 50 years following the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union placed nuclear weapons there just 90 miles from our shore. Sanctions are the last step the government can take without actually going to war. Since the fall of communism, there's been a shift in international conflicts towards the Middle East, starting with the Iran hostage crisis, in which the U.S. embassy was overtaken and American hostages held for over a year. The U.S. and NATO has fought two wars with Iraq, the first known as the Gulf War, or Operation Desert Storm. Since 9/11, America has fought a war on terror, and this has led to two wars in the Middle East. The second with Iraq, which took out their leader Saddam Hussein, and the other is the war in Afghanistan, where the terrorists of 9/11 trained, including Osama bin Laden. The war on terror continues to be an issue with the attacks in Paris. And that is the end of Part 3, Government Politics and Political Policies. Part 4 is...
Okay, I'm going to show you one more review, and then you'll be finished. So again, we're just going over this as what we've covered this year. Remember, again, you're not having an SOL test. So when it refers to state exam, that is not what we're doing. This is, again, just to review what we have learned about this year.
First thing you need to know is different forms of government. This will explain who holds power in these governments and how they operate. The first two forms of government are familiar to Americans: direct democracy and representative democracy. Remember, democracy means the people are in charge. Democracy means voting. Direct democracy is where all of the people make the decisions for the state. And while we don't have a direct democracy form of government, we do have aspects in our representative democracy. Some states let people vote on amendments, and some towns let the people vote on laws. What America has is a representative democracy, or a republic, which means we vote on representatives to pass laws and make decisions for us. And representative democracies are a popular form of government throughout the world. Socialism and communism are very much tied together. Both forms sought to fix the imbalance between the rich business owners and and the working masses. Both involve public ownership of business, which means the government owns and runs some businesses. For socialism, this might mean free healthcare and education run by the state, and the communist forms of government that developed took a more extreme approach to this idea, taking control of all businesses and private property. The idea was everything would be shared, but it didn't really work out that way. If you have a test question about the rights of workers or the government controlling business, your answer is either socialism or communism, and just think of communism as being the more extreme version of the two. Monarchies are ruled by kings or queens. Absolute monarchies were big in the Middle Ages, where a king or queen had absolute power to pass and enforce laws and run the state. One of the few absolute monarchies left is Saudi Arabia, and this is the one the state seems to use as an example. Most monarchies that are left are constitutional monarchies, like Great Britain, which has a king or a queen, but they are mostly just ceremonial figureheads without any power to rule. Two other words you need to know that describe forms of government are oligarchy, which is ruled by a few, and autocracy, which is ruled by one. And these words can describe how the different forms operate. Your next question, what are systems of government? Systems of government describe how power flows between the different levels of government. For instance, America has a federal system of government in which power is shared between the national or central government and state or regional governments. Look for arrows explaining the direction power flows. In a confederal system, which America had during the Articles of Confederation, the states or regional governments had all of the power, and they tell the national or central government what to do. There aren't many confederal systems left, but there are a few. In a unitary system like they have in Great Britain, the national or central government has all of the power, usually because there aren't any state or regional governments, just local ones that the national government delegates powers to. A parliamentary system of government isn't about levels of government, but about branches. In a parliamentary system, the executive, often called the prime minister, is chosen by the legislative branch, often called parliament. This is different from our presidential system, in which the people vote for the legislative branch, but they also choose the executive or president. So what do you need to know about the three branches? Well, first and foremost, you need to know their jobs. The legislative, our national one, is called Congress, which makes laws. The executive, the president or governor, enforces the law. The judicial, headed by the Supreme Court, interprets the law. Most of your test questions will be about the powers. You need to know the enumerated powers of Congress. And remember, enumerated means they are listed in the Constitution. Congress has the power to tax, regulate commerce or trade, coin money, approve presidential appointments, impeach or remove from office the president or judges, support the Army and Navy, declare war, make the rules of naturalization and immigration, confirm treaties, and make all, quote, necessary and proper laws, which we call the Elastic Clause. The executive enforces the law. They are the commander-in-chief, they sign treaties, appoint judges and department heads, and can call Congress into special session. Remember, the executive also recommends laws and appoints ambassadors. Hopefully you remember that the Constitution wasn't very specific about the judicial branch. It stated that there would be one Supreme Court and that Congress could make, quote, inferior courts. It said that judges would serve for life as long as they maintained, quote, good behavior, and that judges would be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. It also said that the Supreme Court would have original jurisdiction, or the power to hear court cases first, for those involving ambassadors or representatives from other countries, maritime issues or those that take place at sea, and cases involving two or more states. Otherwise, the Supreme Court has what's known as appellate jurisdiction, cases that have been appealed to the highest court. Again, it took the case of Marbury versus Madison to establish the main power of the Supreme Court, judicial review, or the power to declare a law unconstitutional. What are the different levels of courts? The federal court system and the various state court systems are similar in that they both have 3 levels. At the bottom in Florida, like most other states, you have county or circuit courts where the trial starts. And this is the same for U.S. district courts. This is the level where you have juries and witnesses, where most cases start and end. Above this level, you have courts of appeals that have appellate jurisdiction, where small panels of judges will decide if the defendant had a fair trial the first time. If a defendant loses on appeal, they might convince the Supreme Court to hear their case, although this is very rare. The only difference between the two systems of courts is that if a defendant loses at the state Supreme Court, they can appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, but it can't go back the other way. So how do national and state governments share power? Our system of sharing power between national and state governments, again, is called federalism, from our federal system of government. Your state exam might show you a Venn diagram, like the one we see here, to compare state and federal powers or responsibilities. In one portion, you will see enumerated/delegated powers to describe the national or federal powers. In the middle, the shared portion are called concurrent powers. And in the other portion are the reserved or state powers. The national enumerated/delegated powers include maintaining the military and declaring war, the U.S. Postal Service, regulating interstate and foreign trade, and coining money. As you know, there are a lot more, but these are the examples most often provided in this chart. For concurrent powers, both levels of government can tax, they can provide for the public welfare, establish courts, borrow money, and build highways. For state powers, remember, we get the name reserve powers for the states from the 10th Amendment, which says that all powers not delegated to the national government are reserved for the states. And these include establishing local governments, intra-state trade, which is trade within the state boundaries, elections, public safety, marriage, and driver's licenses. I've seen practice tests where they will give you this exact chart and ask you what the title of the chart should be, and the answer is federalism. How are national amendments passed? For federal amendments or national amendments, it requires a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of state legislatures or conventions. Remember, 2/3 of Congress, 3/4 of the states. We'll look at state amendments in a minute, but this is how you make national amendments. How are laws passed? The lawmaking process at the national and state levels are very similar. First, an idea for a bill, again a bill is a proposed law, can be suggested by anyone, but a member of Congress must officially sponsor or initiate that bill, and they can do that in either house. The bill is then sent to committee, where most bills die or get passed on. Next, they are sent to the floor of the House or the Senate for debate and amendments, and then they are voted on. If they've made it that far, they are sent to the other house, where the process starts all over. Committee, debate, and amendments, vote, and after it's gone through both houses, it gets sent to a conference committee to make sure the two versions of the bill match up. After that, they are sent to the president, who can either sign the bill, making it law, or veto the bill, in which it gets sent back to Congress. Now, Congress can override the president's veto with a 2/3 vote, but this is pretty rare. How do the U.S. and Florida constitutions compare? For starters, they both begin with very similar preambles, starting with those 3 famous words, "We the people." The U.S. Constitution is much shorter. It has 7 articles to the Florida's 12. They both protect people's rights, the U.S. with the Bill of Rights added to it, and the Florida contains the Declaration of Rights at the beginning. This has many of the same rights, including the 5 freedoms, the right to bear arms, but including a longer list of rights. The Florida also has way more amendments that are very specific, dealing with day-to-day issues, including education, motor vehicles, and elections. The Florida Constitution also includes several ways to pass amendments, including an initiative where people can gather signatures and then vote on whether an amendment will pass. There is a Constitutional Revision Commission that meets every 20 years to suggest amendments or changes to the state constitution. The state legislature can pass amendments known as joint resolutions by a 3/5 vote of both houses. So unlike the U.S. Constitution, there are many ways to amend the Florida Constitution, and way more amendments get passed. And finally, you have to know what services are provided by which level of government. We looked at this a little before. For the federal government, think big things like disaster relief, environmental issues that affect the whole country, not just locally, keeping our foods and medicines safe, large welfare programs like Social Security and Medicaid, the Postal Service, and interstate highways. For states, you want to think education programs, state environmental issues, driver's licenses and licenses for businesses and certain professions like my Florida teacher's license, state highways, state police, and public safety programs. For local, it's local police, fire departments, libraries, schools, local roads, and trash collection. Here's a look at those national programs and state programs and local programs. And that is it, my friends.
All right, so after this, you can go on to iExcel and type in grade 8 social studies, and you can participate for 10 minutes or so, just looking at just different review questions. If you have any questions, you can email me. I hope you have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.